The platform smelled like burnt coffee and rail grease, a cold wind cutting through every time the train doors opened. Samuel Byler stood at the counter with 2 folded paper tickets in one hand, his small daughter's hand in the other, and he did not look up when the woman behind him sighed. He wore a brown barn coat over a pale blue shirt, a black felt hat set low and straight, and boots with a rind of dried mud still crusted along the sole from that morning's walk to the milk house. Beside him stood Ruth, 9 years old, in a navy dress and a white prayer bonnet, a small denim backpack held in her lap, both arms wrapped around it the way she held it whenever a place was unfamiliar. Samuel had paid for both tickets in cash, creased $100 bills folded into a handkerchief, and the counter agent had counted them twice before she believed him. In 11 minutes, a woman in a dark green dress, arms already crossed, would demand his seat in front of his daughter. In 19 minutes, a conductor would come running down the aisle, white-faced, asking if anyone had ever worked a train's control cab. And in 22 minutes, the man they had shoved out of first class like a stray dog would be the only person on board who could bring that train back onto the rails alive, with his daughter's eyes on him the whole time. He had not touched a control panel in 14 years. He had told himself every one of those years that he never would again. He was wrong. Lancaster, 6:40 in the morning. Samuel had risen before the rooster the way he always did, and hitched Duke to the buggy in a cold that bit through wool. Ruth had begged to come along. She had cousins in Ohio she hadn't seen since last harvest. And after a long look, Samuel had let her. His daughter-in-law packed them bread and dried apples for the trip, wrapped twice in cloth, tucked beside a folder he hadn't opened in a decade. The folder was the only reason he was standing in a station at all. His brother's widow, out in Ohio, needed a signature on land papers before the bank closed the window on her. Samuel could have mailed it, he almost had. But there was a clause buried in page 4 that no lawyer in that county had caught, and some part of him, some old, careful part of him, he thought he'd buried under the wheat fields, had read it in under 30 seconds and known exactly what it meant. So he travelled, once, a direct trip there, and back before the week was out if the schedule held. Ruth had never ridden a train. She held his sleeve the whole way down the platform and didn't let go until they found their seats. He didn't tell anyone at the counter that as a boy he had learned to read a brake gauge before he'd learned to read scripture. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to men who used to be loud in a different life. Samuel carried it the way other men carry a limp. Samuel's father had been a locomotive engineer. Not Amish, not then. A man who spent 30 years in the cab of trains before the lines went automated, before everything changed. Samuel grew up among night shifts and engine oil, learning to listen to a train the way other boys learned to listen for footsteps in the hallway at home. By 12, he could already identify a brake fault by sound, before any warning light lit up. His father used to say he had rail ears, a gift you don't teach, only inherit. 14 years earlier, on a Tuesday no different from any other, Samuel had been in the control cab of a regional passenger train when the braking system failed on a grade no manual had accounted for. He got the train stopped. Everyone survived. Everyone but one boy in car 14, 9 years old, who had a heart condition no manifest had flagged and who didn't make it through the ambulance ride. The boy had had his own son's exact laugh. Samuel had heard it once, over the car's speaker, before the brakes failed, the boy laughing at something his mother said, and he had smiled without meaning to, the way you smile at a familiar song on the radio. He never worked with trains again after that. He sold what he owned, drove until the roads got smaller and the fences got wooden, and knocked on the door of a bishop who didn't ask why a stranger wanted to disappear into plainness. He kept his name. There had never been a reason to hide it, only a reason to stop explaining what he used to do with it. Nobody at the milk house, the cell meetings, or the market stalls had any cause to know that the quiet man beside them had once held 200 lives steady in his hands in the cab of a train running 100 miles an hour. Not even Ruth knew. She only knew her father as a man who read his Bible before sunrise and never raised his voice, not with anyone. The two worlds lived in him at once, the wheat and the rail, and he had never once been sure, not on his best day, that he'd chosen the right one. The station agent had upgraded them without asking, a system error, a seat block released too late, and by the time she realized her mistake, Samuel and Ruth were already seated in first class, cream leather seats facing each other by the window, his hat in his lap, her backpack still held tight to her chest, his hands folded the way his mother had taught him, calloused palms up, waiting. That was when Diane Marchetti arrived. She came down the aisle in a dark green dress, phone pressed between her shoulder and ear, a rolling case that cost more than Samuel's farm equipment. She stopped beside him and looked at him the way people look at a stain on a tablecloth, then crossed her arms and waited for someone else to solve the problem for her. "That's my seat," she said, not to him, to the conductor approaching down the aisle, a young woman in a navy uniform with a red scarf knotted at her collar. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move," the conductor said. She didn't look at his ticket. She looked at his hat, the brown coat, the mud still ghosted along his boot soles, the absence of a phone in his hand, the folded cash receipt instead of a digital pass on a screen. And she looked briefly at his daughter and did not soften. Coach class is that way. "I have a ticket," Samuel said, quiet, holding it out, "for both of us." "Sir." The conductor's voice hardened, and she took his elbow, not gently, while Ruth's small hand found the hem of his sleeve and held on. Passengers in the nearby rows watched over tablets and coffee cups. "This isn't a negotiation." Diane Marchetti didn't thank him. She didn't look at him again. She settled into her seat, tucked her skirt around her knees, and asked for a warm towel before the doors had even closed. Samuel walked back to coach with his hat in one hand and his daughter's fingers laced through the other, and nobody on that train, not one soul, knew what had just been shoved to the back of the train instead of staying at the front of it. The train had already crossed an hour into the Ohio countryside, fields that, seen through the window, looked something like the fields Samuel had left that morning, the same checkerboard of green and gold, 100 farms he'd never know pretending for a moment to be his own. Ruth pressed her face to the glass and said it looked like God had ironed the whole world flat, and Samuel almost laughed for the first time all day. Something in the sound of the train changed, not loud, not dramatic. A shift in the pitch of the wheels that most passengers would sleep straight through. Samuel's hand went still on the armrest between them. He had heard that exact sound once before, 14 years ago. In a different cab, in a different life, with a 9-year-old boy laughing somewhere behind him. He looked down at Ruth, 9 years old herself, still watching the fields go by, and something cold moved through his chest. He closed his eyes and told himself it was nothing. The train held steady. The conductors kept moving down the aisle with the cart, offering snacks, and for 4 full minutes, Samuel Byler sat very still, one hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, hoping he was only an old man remembering an old fear. Then the train lurched, not violently, but wrong, half a second of a pull that emptied every stomach on board, and somewhere up front, a woman screamed. Ruth grabbed his arm with both hands and didn't let go. The door to the control cab opened onto chaos that had no name yet. The engineer was slumped forward against the console, unresponsive, a sudden cardiac event, though no one in the car knew that word yet, only that a man who was supposed to be running the train was not moving. The assistant conductor, alone now, fought a braking system that was responding wrong. The train picking up speed on a downgrade, the automatic controls weren't correcting. A conductor came running down the aisle, asking the only question that mattered, her voice cracking on every word. "Does anyone..." Is there anyone on this train who knows how to run a controlled cab? Diane Marchetti didn't look up from her phone, which had no signal, though she kept tapping it anyway, as if outrage alone might restore a bar or two. Nobody raised a hand. Samuel looked once at his daughter's face, pale and frightened and trusting all at once, and understood there was no version of the next few minutes where he stayed quiet, and both of them stayed alive. He knelt in front of her seat first. "Ruth, I need you to sit with this lady." A grandmother 2 rows up had already reached out an arm. "And hold her hand. And don't look at what's happening outside. Can you do that for me?" Ruth nodded, wide-eyed, and didn't ask the question every adult around her was too afraid to ask, which was whether her father actually knew what he was about to say. Then, standing, an old, plain, quiet man in a brown coat took off his hat, still holding it in his hand, and said the one sentence he had sworn he would never say again. "I can run this train." The conductor stared at him the way you stare at something that doesn't fit into the world you thought you understood. "Sir, this isn't... We need someone with actual experience." "My father was an engineer for 30 years, Samuel said, already moving down the aisle. "I grew up in his cab. I know this braking system better than most people who certify on it." The assistant conductor, sweating through his shirt, turned in the cab doorway and looked at the old man in the shadow of a black hat, and something in his face changed, some flicker of recall he couldn't yet place. "Byler," the assistant conductor said slowly, reading the old man's eyes rather than any badge, because there was no badge. I heard of a Byler 20 years back among the old engineers on this line. They said his father had the best rail ears anyone had ever seen on this route, and that the sun just stopped after some accident and never came back." "After," Samuel agreed and said nothing more. He didn't need to say more. He set his hat on the empty jump seat, rolled back sleeves over forearms, roped with the kind of strength that comes from hauling hay bales and fence posts for 14 years, and took the controls the way another man might take a hand he had refused for a very long time. The brake overheat warning light was still burning red when his hands closed around the panel, and for the first time in 14 years, Samuel Byler did not feel like he was betraying anyone by holding it, not the boy in car 14, and not the girl 2 rows back with her hand held tight in a stranger's. He didn't operate the way passengers would have expected of a plain farmer. He operated the way a man operates when the motion is stitched into muscle memory too deep for 14 years of wheat fields to erase. He cut power to the traction motors, bled pressure from the main system, and switched over to the manual emergency brake, correcting the imbalance with a calm that came out flat, clear, and utterly without panic. Below them, the fields unrolled wide and green, and for one strange moment it looked enough like home that he had to remind himself it wasn't. That his own barn, the one he'd built with his own hands, was still hundreds of miles behind him, and that his daughter was 3 rows behind that. "Bringing her down to an emergency stop," he said into the cab radio, giving position, speed, distance remaining to the next station, in the clipped shorthand of a man who had said those words 1,000 times before most people on this train were born. In first class, Diane Marchetti had gone the color of the seat cushion. She hadn't moved. She hadn't asked what was happening. For the first time since the platform, she was entirely perfectly silent. The train bled off speed by degrees, brakes groaning against the rail in a sound that ran the length of the whole train. Until it came to a final jolt, the grandmother holding Ruth's hand would later say she wasn't even sure she'd felt until the silence took over the whole car. Emergency vehicles lined up along the track, lights turning without sirens, the way they do when the crisis is already over and only the paperwork remains. Paramedics carried the stricken engineer off on a stretcher, alive, stable, already blinking at the lights. The assistant conductor stood in the cab doorway and wouldn't stop shaking Samuel's hand. "Mr. Byler," he said, loud enough that half the front car heard it. I don't even know what to—" "I'm not an engineer," Samuel said quietly, already looking past him for a small navy dress and a white bonnet. "Not anymore." But the railway's regional director called out to the tracks before the train had even finished coming to a full stop. Didn't agree. She stood by the car door with a tablet in her hand and Samuel's old certification record already pulled up on the screen, and she said his full name out loud, loud enough for first class to hear it too, a name he had never hidden, only stopped explaining. Ruth ran to him before he reached the door and buried her face in his coat, and he held her there, one hand still smelling faintly of brake oil and hot metal. Diane Marchetti sat frozen in the seat she had taken from him and watched the conductor who had gripped his elbow that morning go the color of paper. "Sir," the conductor said, coming to find him at the door, "I am so sorry. I didn't know who—" "You didn't need to know who I was," Samuel said, not unkindly, one hand resting on his daughter's bonnet. "You needed to look at the ticket in my hand." The railway suspended her from active duty that same evening. Diane Marchetti's name went into the incident report too, right alongside the conductor's. A footnote nobody would read aloud, but one that would follow her onto every future trip she ever tried to book with that line again. Samuel didn't ask for any of it. Once the widow's papers were signed and witnessed that same afternoon, the errand finally finished. He found a phone to borrow so he could tell her it was done. And then he started the long way home, Ruth's hand back in his the whole time, as if she meant never to let go of it again. They rode the last 11 miles in a hired car, the sun already low, and Samuel asked the driver to let them off at the end of the lane so they could walk the rest. Duke was waiting at the fence the way he always waited, unbothered by any of it, and the smell of wood smoke and turned earth came up the lane to meet them before the house did. Ruth ran ahead through the gate, backpack bouncing, calling out to her older brother that she had ridden on a train, and it had almost gone off the rails, and their father had brought it to a stop. Somewhere past the barn, his daughter-in-law was calling the children in for supper, and the sound of it, ordinary, unremarkable, entirely his, settled into his chest like something finally set down after being carried too long. He hung his coat on its peg. He didn't correct Ruth's story, and he didn't add to it either. He never would, not fully, not in a way that let anyone else carry it with him. That night, lying awake with the wind moving the curtain the way it always did, Samuel Byler thought of the boy in car 14, and of the boy's laugh, and of the sound a brake makes right before it fails. He thought of his daughter's hand, finding his sleeve on the platform and holding on. He thought of the rail and the wheat, the two lives folded into one man, and he still didn't know. After everything, after the emergency stop, after the years, whether he had chosen the right one. He only knew that when the world needed the part of him he had buried, it had still been there, whole, waiting, the way a well waits under snow, and that this time at least his own daughter had been close enough to see it. Some men carry the world quietly until the world needs them. It rarely says thank you. It doesn't need to. They were never doing it to be thanked.